jar of hot sauce sat on the counter of a diner in Beaumont, Texas, and the woman behind it had $37 in her checking account and a note from the bank that had arrived that morning and that she had not opened yet because she already knew what it said. 2 years later, she would stand in a cold aisle at a Target in Houston, watching a stranger pick up a bauble with her mother's name on it and put it in a cart without stopping to read the label. But that was still 2 years away. And before it came, there was the matter of $37 and a jar of hot sauce and a diner owner named Phil Decker, who had no idea he was about to change her life. Rosalind Vega was 51 years old when her husband of 22 years died on a Tuesday in March. He had not been sick. He had gone to work as a plumber for a company on College Street and had come home in the evening and had sat down to eat the pork shoulder. She had slow cooked all day and had said it was good the way he always said things were good, meaning it, not performing it. And then he had gone to sleep and had not woken up. The doctor said it was his heart. The family said it was too soon. Both things were true. His name was Arturo. He had been a quiet man who laughed at the same 3 jokes regardless of how many times he told them. He had kept a mint plant on the back porch that he watered every morning before he got in the truck. After he died, Rosalind watered it for a week. Then she stopped. Then she started again. The mint did not know the difference. It grew anyway. The money situation became clear slowly, and then all at once, the way certain kinds of bad news reveal themselves. The life insurance policy had lapsed 18 months earlier. Arturo had been meaning to renew it. He had said so in October and again in January. He had been the kind of man who said things and meant them and sometimes ran out of time. The mortgage on the house on Garfield Street was 4 months behind. There were 2 credit cards and a truck payment and a hospital bill from December when Rosalind had gotten a respiratory infection and had gone to the ER because she did not have a primary care doctor and did not know what else to do. She added it up at the kitchen table on a Thursday night with a legal pad and a pen, and the specific kind of quiet that a house has when it used to hold more people than it does now. The number she arrived at was not a number she could manage on the administrative assistant salary she had earned before Arturo died, and could not manage at all now because she had taken bereavement leave and the company had decided during her absence to eliminate her position. She sat with the legal pad for a long time. Then she folded it in half and put it in the drawer under the microwave. She did not throw it away. Throwing it away would have felt like something she was not ready to do. Her mother's name was Concepcion. Everyone had called her Connie except Rosalind, who had called her Mom, and the priest at St. Anthony's, who had called her by her full name at Mass and at her funeral 9 years earlier. Connie had come to Texas from Jalisco in 1971 with a suitcase, $40, a cousin's address in Houston, and a recipe for salsa roja that her own mother had passed to her the way mothers pass things that matter, not by writing them down, not at first, but by standing close and making you watch and saying the names of the things out loud while your hands learned the motions. The recipe lived in Rosalind's memory the way certain things live there, not in words, but in sequence. The smell of dried guajito peppers coming back to life in the pan. The sound of them against the cast iron, the way the garlic went in after, and the tomatoes, and the exact moment when the whole thing changed from a collection of ingredients into something else. Something unified and deep and carrying in it the specific heat of a woman who had crossed a border with $40 and rebuilt everything from the ground that was available to her. Connie had made the sauce for tamales and enchiladas and eggs and everything else that needed it, which was most things. She had given jars of it to neighbors and to the women at church and to anyone who knocked on the door during the holidays. She had never sold it. It had not occurred to her to sell it. The sauce was for feeding people, not for making money, and those were different activities in her mind, separated by a line she had never examined because she had never needed to cross it. Rosalind had grown up making it beside her. She had made it in her own kitchen for 22 years of marriage, and for holidays, and for potlucks, and for the quinceañera of her niece, and for the neighborhood block party where 3 people had come back and asked her what was in it, and she had said her mother's recipe, and they had said you should sell this, and she had smiled and moved on, because you should sell this is something people say the way they say you should write a book, meaning it as a compliment, not as instruction. The morning after she sat with a legal pad, Rosalind opened the cabinet above the stove. She had guajillo peppers, she had dried arbol chills, she had garlic and tomatoes and the specific combination of spices that she had adjusted over years until they matched what she remembered of her mother's kitchen, which was not an exact replica and was not meant to be. It was what her hands had arrived at through repetition, which is a different kind of accuracy. She made a batch. She filled 4 jars. She put them on the counter and looked at them and thought about the legal pad in the drawer under the microwave. Then she picked up one of the jars and walked 3 blocks to the diner on Magnolia Avenue, where she had eaten breakfast on Saturday mornings with Arturo for the last 12 years. Phil Decker had owned the diner since 1994. He was 63 years old and had the look of a man who had been awake since 4 in the morning for 30 years, which he had. He was drying a coffee mug when Rosalind came in, and he nodded at her the way he always nodded at her, with recognition and without ceremony. She put the jar on the counter. She said, "I need an honest opinion." He put down the mug. He opened the jar. He found a spoon and tasted the sauce from the spoon the way a person tastes something when they are actually evaluating it and not just being polite. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What's in it?" She said, "My mother's recipe." He tasted it again. He looked at the jar. He said, "I'd been putting Cholula on my eggs for 30 years because I didn't know there was an option. Where can I get more of this?" She said, "You just did." She left 2 jars with him and walked home. She did not know yet that this was the beginning of anything. She thought it might be a way to make enough money to get through the next few weeks. She did not have a longer plan than that. Sometimes the plan you make at the beginning is only as long as the fear you're standing in, and then later, you make a bigger one. Phil called her on a Friday. He said the sauce was gone. He said 2 of his regular customers had asked where they could buy it. He said a woman who ran a food booth at the farmer's market on Calder Avenue had come in for lunch and had tried it on her eggs and had left a note with her number. The note was from a woman named Bet Samuelson. She sold honey and pepper jelly at the market on Saturdays, and she had been doing it long enough to understand the difference between people who liked something and people who would come back for it. She had a table with extra space. She said Rosalind could share it for $15 a week. Rosalind made 3 dozen jars that week. She labeled them by hand with a piece of masking tape and a black marker. She wrote Connie's Salsa Roja. She did not overthink the name. It was her mother's recipe. It had her mother's name. That was the most accurate thing she could put on a label. She arrived at the market at 6:30 on a Saturday morning with a cardboard box and no table of her own and no display and no strategy beyond the jars themselves. Bet gave her half the table and a folding chair and a bottle of water and the specific practical generosity of a woman who had once been new to something and had not forgotten it. By 9 o'clock, Rosalind had sold 11 jars. By 11, she had sold 22. At 11:45, she sold the last one to a man who said he was buying 3 because he was afraid she would sell out before he got back, which she already had. She sat in the folding chair after the last jar was gone and looked at the empty box. She had brought 36 jars. She had priced them at $6 each. She had sold out before noon. $216, minus the cost of ingredients, minus the table fee. She had not brought enough. That was the only problem. She had not brought enough. She drove home and made another batch. She did the math on the back of a grocery receipt. Guajillo peppers, dried arbol chilies, canned tomatoes, garlic, cumin, apple cider vinegar, salt, lids, jars. Her cost per jar was approximately $1.80. At $6 a jar, her margin was $4.80. At $6 a jar, her margin was $4.80. At 36 jars, that was $151.20 in profit from a Saturday morning. She did the math again. It came out the same. She looked at the number and did not cry. She was not a woman who cried at kitchen tables. She was a woman who wrote numbers on the backs of receipts and then made more batches. The second Saturday, she brought 54 jars. She sold 48. The third Saturday, she brought 70 and sold 61. She started taking orders by phone for people who did not want to risk missing her before she sold out, because she always sold out and the market regulars had begun to figure out that waiting until 10 was too late. There was a problem she had not anticipated. The Texas cottage food law was specific. You could make shelf-stable foods in your home kitchen and sell them directly to customers. No commercial kitchen required. No state inspection. But the law capped direct sales at $50,000 per year and prohibited selling through any third party. No stores, no restaurants, no online shipping. She could sell at the farmer's market. She could sell at her front door. She could not sell to Phil Decker for his diner, which meant the 2 jars she had left with him were technically the last 2. She learned this from a woman at the market named Opal Christensen, who sold kettle corn, and who had been navigating the Texas cottage food laws for 6 years, and who explained them the way people explain things they have had to learn by making expensive mistakes. Opal said, "You're going to hit the ceiling faster than you think, especially if it rains and you lose a Saturday." Rosalind had not thought about rain. She thought about it after. She went to the public library on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at a computer and read for 2 hours. She learned what a commercial food license required. She learned that a certified commercial kitchen needed to be inspected by the county health department, with stainless steel surfaces and commercial refrigeration and proper ventilation and a 3-compartment sink. She learned that renting time in a shared commercial kitchen in Beaumont cost between $18 and $30 an hour. She learned that liability insurance for a food business started at around $450 a year. She wrote the numbers on the back of an envelope. She added them up. The total was not impossible, but it required money she was currently making from the thing that needed the money to keep going. She was thinking about this on the drive home when her phone rang. It was her daughter, Marisol. Marisol was 28 and lived in Houston and worked in pharmaceutical sales and called her mother every Sunday and sometimes on Tuesdays when something was bothering her. This was a Thursday, which meant she had already heard. Someone from the market had apparently posted about Connie's Salsa Roja on a neighborhood Facebook group, and someone from that group had shared it, and it had moved the way things move when they are genuinely good and the people who find them feel like they have discovered something personal. Marisol had seen the post from 100 miles away. She said, "Mom, people are talking about your sauce." Rosalind said, "I know." Marisol said, "Are you scaling up?" Rosalind was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't have a commercial kitchen." Marisol said, "I'll look into it." Marisol had always been the kind of person who said she would look into something and then actually did. By Saturday, she had found a church fellowship kitchen in Beaumont that had been certified as a commercial facility 3 years earlier when the pastor's wife had started a catering operation, and that now rented time to small food producers for $20 an hour. The pastor was a man named Reverend Gaines. He answered on the second ring. The kitchen was larger than anything Rosalind had worked in. 2 ranges, a commercial oven, a 6-burner industrial cooktop, a 3-compartment sink, stainless steel counters that did not have the small burn mark from the pot she had left too long, did not have the stain from the salsa that had splattered during Marisol's 7th birthday. Those marks belonged to her kitchen at home. This kitchen belonged to no one yet and was waiting to belong to the work. She stood in front of the commercial range the first night and turned on one of the burners and held her hand above it. The heat was even. It did not favor one side. She had spent so many years knowing the particular quirks of her own stove, the way the back left burner ran hotter than the dial suggested, the way the oven held moisture differently depending on the season, that cooking on equipment that simply did what it was told felt like adjusting to a different language. She understood the grammar. She had to learn the accent. The first commercial batch was 200 jars. She worked from 6 in the evening until 11 at night in the church kitchen, and she drove home with the smell of guachiol peppers in her hair and 48 more jars than she had been able to produce at home. She sold them across 2 Saturdays. The revenue was larger than any number she had put on a receipt. She did not frame it. She did not post about it. She put the money in the savings account she had opened with the first 36 jars and let it sit there, doing the quiet, useful work of becoming enough. By month 3, she had a routine. Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the church kitchen. Saturday at the market. Phone orders filled on Fridays. The cadence had replaced the silence that the house had had since March, and she was not sure whether that was a grief strategy or just a life. and she was not in a position to examine the difference. There was an incident in the 4th month that nearly stopped everything. A woman had left a review on the Facebook post that said she had opened a jar and the seal had not been right, and that the sauce had gone bad before the expiration date. She posted it publicly with her name and with the words "Food Safety Concern" in capital letters. Rosalind read it at 11 at night on her phone in bed and did not sleep. In the morning she called Marisol. Marisol said, "Do you have records of that batch? Dates, temperatures, processing times?" Rosalind had records. She had kept a notebook since the 2nd week, writing down every batch, every ingredient amount, every processing time. She had done this not because she had been told to, but because it was the thing her hands wanted to do while she was learning, the same way her mother had eventually written down the recipe that she had first taught through proximity. She pulled the notebook and found the batch. She had processed every jar to the correct temperature and for the correct time. She had checked the seals before labeling. She called the woman and offered to replace the jar. The woman did not call back. The comment stayed up for 11 days before the woman deleted it. Rosalind did not know what had actually happened to the woman's jar. She never found out. What she did find out, by reading 2 hours of food safety documentation at the library, was that proper labeling had to include the processing date and a clear expiration date and a statement that the product was made in a home kitchen, even though she was now using the church kitchen, which was not technically a home kitchen. She updated her labels. She bought a label printer. The labels were no longer handwritten. She had not wanted to give up the handwritten labels. There was something in them that felt like her mother's handwriting in the margins of things. But the printed labels were more legible and more precise, and the customers trusted them in a way that had practical consequences for the business. Some things you let go of because you have to, some things you keep. The trick is knowing which is which. She filed for an LLC in month 5. The filing fee was $150, paid from the account that had started with 36 jars of sauce and grown to something that, when she looked at it, still felt like it belonged to someone with a plan. She was not sure she had a plan. She had a notebook and a routine and a church kitchen that was available on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The license for the commercial food permit took 3 weeks and required an inspection of the church kitchen, which had already been certified, and a food handler certification, which she completed online an afternoon, and a liability insurance policy, which cost $480 a year through a small business insurer that Opal had recommended. She held the license on the porch because she had not wanted to open it inside the house. The envelope was thin, which she took as a bad sign, and then opened it and found that thin envelopes can hold significant things. Marisol was in Houston. Rosalind called her instead of waiting. She said, "I got the license." Marisol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom." "Okay, so now what?" Rosalind said, "Now I can sell to restaurants." She called Phil Decker that evening. He said he had been waiting. He placed an order for 30 jars per week. He said he was putting it on his menu as a house sauce, and that he needed it to be consistent because his customers were going to expect it. She said, "It'll be consistent." She meant it. The church kitchen and the notebook and the years of making the same sauce in the same sequence had made her hands reliable in the way that hands become reliable when they have done the same thing enough times that the motion precedes the thought. By the end of the first year, revenue was $41,000. She had been selling for 11 months, not 12, because the first month had been the market and Phil's Diner and nothing else. $41,000 from jars of her mother's hot sauce, from a recipe that Concepcion had carried across a border in 1971 and had never thought to write down for the first decade she used it. Rosalind sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook she had been keeping since the first batch. Not the recipe notebook, a different one, a black and white marbled cover she had bought at the dollar store because it felt like the kind of notebook that was meant to hold numbers. She went through it page by page, revenue by week, costs by batch, kitchen rental, ingredients, labels, insurance, the license fee, the LLC filing. The mint plant was still on the back porch. She had kept watering it. It was the size now that it had been when Arturo maintained it, which was probably coincidence and was probably not. She wrote the number 41,000 on the last page of the notebook and sat with it. It was more money than she had made in any single year of her life, doing a job that had her name on a badge and not on anything else. She had not started with a business plan. She had started with a jar and a question from a diner owner who wanted to know what was in it. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon in March, almost exactly 1 year after Arturo died. She was in the church kitchen filling jars. Her hands were in motion, the kind of motion that requires no thought, and her phone was on the counter beside the sink because Marisol called sometimes during the week, and Rosalind had stopped missing calls from her daughter since the first one she had missed, and the hour it had taken Marisol to stop worrying. The number on the screen was an area code she did not recognize. 512. Austin. She almost put the phone back down. She had been getting calls about her sauce from people who had seen the Facebook posts and the market regulars and the review that Phil had gotten from a food blogger who had written 4 paragraphs about the diner and 2 of them about the sauce. She had been handling these calls herself since she did not have anyone else to handle them, and she had gotten skilled at the specific kind of conversation where someone wanted more than she could currently provide. She answered. A woman identified herself as a regional buyer for Target. She said her name was Dawn Carver. She said she was based in Austin and that she was calling about a product called Connie's Salsa Roja, and that she had heard about it from a store manager at a Target in Beaumont, who had tried it at the farmer's market and brought a jar to a team meeting, and that the jar had made it to a quarterly tasting where a product development coordinator had tried it and passed it up. Rosalind stood in the church kitchen with the phone against her ear and the jars on the counter half filled and the burner still on and the smell of guajillo peppers in the air, and she did not move. Dawn said, Target ran a program called Accelerators for local and regional food producers who were ready to move into retail. She said the program was designed for small businesses that had something a large commercial brand could not replicate. She said Target was looking for authentic products with a story and with production capacity and with retail-ready packaging and a barcode. She listed what would be needed: retail packaging, a UPC barcode registered through GS1, proof of commercial food license, liability insurance documentation, production capacity projections, shelf life testing, a suggested retail price, a cost sheet showing margin at scale. Each item arrived with its own weight. Rosalind said, How long do I have? Dawn said 8 weeks to the review meeting. Rosalind said, I'll be there. She turned off the burner. She sat down on the floor of the church kitchen, the way a person sits when their legs have made a decision independently of the rest of them. The tile was cold. The fluorescent lights made their quiet noise above her. She sat there for a while and did not try to make the moment into anything other than what it was, which was large. Then she stood up and finished the batch. The 8 weeks were the most compressed weeks of her adult life. She made a list on a notepad that first night: packaging, barcode, co-packer, shelf life test, insurance certificate, cost sheet. Each word was a task. Each task was a cost. Each cost had to come from the money she was making from the thing that needed to grow before it could afford to grow. She had been living in this circle for a year. She knew its shape now. She found a packaging designer through a referral from Bet at the market, who knew a woman in Houston who did freelance label design for food products. The designer's name was Tara, and she charged $200 for the full package, meaning the label, the front panel, the nutrition facts panel formatted for retail, the ingredient list, and the allergen statement. Rosalind sent her a photograph of her mother, a photograph of the sauce and a jar on a wooden table, and a single sentence. My mother carried this recipe from Mexico in 1971. She wanted something that looked like that. The design came back in 5 days. It was warm and clean and not complicated, and it looked like something that belonged on a shelf beside the things that had been on shelves for decades. Rosalind approved it on a Thursday afternoon and cried for 11 minutes. And then called Tara to say thank you and then got back to work. The GS1 barcode registration cost $250. The co-packer was the problem. She needed a facility that could produce several hundred jars a week to retail specifications using her recipe and following FDA guidelines for acidified foods. She called 4 facilities. 2 had minimum orders that assumed production volumes she was not at yet. One had a setup fee of $4,000. The fourth was in Seguin, 50 miles away, run by a woman named Dorothy who had a small operation, 8 employees, 2 commercial lines designed for hot sauce and condiment production. Dorothy tasted the sauce twice before agreeing to a trial run. She said, "The garlic balance is unusual." Rosalind said, "It's my mother's." Dorothy said, "That's the part you don't tell anyone." Then she agreed to the trial. Rosalind drove to Seguin with the recipe notebook in the passenger seat. She had written out the full recipe on a separate sheet of paper, a transcription, because she was not ready to hand the original notebook to a production line, the same way she was not ready to do a lot of things she ended up doing anyway, because the alternative was stopping. She stood in the production facility for 4 hours on a Thursday. She watched the cook on Dorothy's line build the sauce from the ingredients in the order she specified. She watched the color develop in the vat, the way it developed in her own pots, the guajillos releasing their deep red, the garlic softening into the base, the whole thing shifting in the last 10 minutes into the version of itself that she recognized. She opened the first jar off the line and smelled it. She tasted it from a plastic spoon. It was not her kitchen. It was not her mother's kitchen. It was a facility in Seguin with equipment that cost more than her house. But the sauce inside the jar was the sauce. Close enough to carry the name. Close enough to carry forward. She said, "Let's do this." The drive to Austin for the Target review was 3 hours. She left at 5 in the morning. Marisol had offered to come. Rosalind had said no, not because she did not want her daughter there, but because she needed the 3 hours alone with the road and the coffee and the specific quiet of early morning driving when the thoughts settle into something you can use. She had brought 12 sample jars in retail packaging. She had the folder with the license and the insurance certificate and the food handler certification, and the co-packing agreement and the cost sheet she had put together at the kitchen table over the course of a week, with the composition notebook open beside her laptop. The numbers were not wrong. She had checked them 4 times. She wore a blazer she had bought at the Goodwill on Phelan Boulevard for $14 because it was clean, and it fit, and she did not own a blazer, and she was not going to spend more than $14 on one until she knew whether she needed it for anything other than this. The Target regional office was large in the way that buildings are large when you are the smallest thing in the lobby. There were other vendors in the hallway. A man with a cooler full of small batch salsa, a woman with a display of flavored olive oils, people who had made things in their kitchens or small facilities and had gotten this far and were sitting with the same specific combination of certainty about their product and uncertainty about the room. Dawn Carver was younger than her voice on the phone. She had 2 colleagues with her and a notebook, and the efficient manner of someone who had done this many times and respected the people who had not. Dawn said, "Tell me about it." Rosalind did not have a presentation. She had the jars and the folder and the story. She said, "My mother came to Texas from Mexico in 1971 with $40 and an address and a recipe she had learned from her mother by standing close and watching and listening to the names of things. She made the sauce for 50 years. She made it for her family and her neighbors and the women at church. She never sold it because in her mind, cooking for people and selling to people were 2 different things, and she never had a reason to cross the line between them. She said, "I crossed it because I had to, because my husband died and my job was gone and I had $37 and a cabinet full of peppers and the memory of my mother's hands." She opened one of the jars and pushed it across the table. She said, "This is what $37 became." Dawn picked up a spoon. She tasted the sauce. She set the spoon down. She tasted it again. She wrote something on her notepad. Then she asked the questions. Shelf life. Cost per unit at scale. Suggested retail. Production capacity. Rosalind answered each one. The numbers were in her head, the way numbers get into your head when you've been living with them for months. 12 weeks at the co-packer's facility, $4.50 a jar at 500 units per week. Suggested retail $5.99 for a 12-ounce jar. Scalable to 1,200 units within 45 days. Dawn wrote each answer down. She did not react to them. Numbers do not need a reaction. They need to be right. After the last question, Dawn looked at her notes. Then she looked up. She said, "We'd like to start with 60 stores in Texas. If the velocity is there in 90 days, we go regional. Rosalind said, "Thank you." She stood. She picked up her folder. She walked down the hallway and out through the lobby and into the parking lot of the Target regional office in Austin, Texas, in the $14 Blazer from the Goodwill on Phelan Boulevard. She sat in the car for a long time. The engine was off. The sun was coming up over the building across the street. She held the folder in her lap and looked at the windshield and let the moment be what it was. Then she called Marisol. Marisol answered on the first ring because she had been awake since 5 o'clock waiting for the call. Rosalind said, 60 stores. The sound Marisol made was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something too large for language arrives and the only thing available is breath. Then she said, "Mom, abuela's recipe." Rosalind said, 60 stores. She drove home. It took 3 hours. She did not listen to the radio. When she got back to Beaumont, she went to the church kitchen. It was a Thursday. She had a regular batch to finish. She turned on the burners. She started the peppers in the pan, the guajillos going into the dry cast iron the way they always went, the way her mother had put them in when she was young and standing at the counter learning the sequence. She made the batch. She filled the jars. She labeled them with the new label, the one Tara had designed, warm and clean with her mother's name in the center. 7 months later, on a Saturday morning, Rosalind drove to the Target on Dowland Road in Beaumont. Marisol had driven up from Houston. She arrived in the parking lot at the same time, which had not been coordinated and which both of them pretended not to find significant. They went in together. Past the entrance, past the registers, past the produce section and the bread and the pasta. Down the condiment aisle. Third shelf, eye level. Between a national brand in a tall, thin bottle and a store label in a squat one. A jar with a warm-colored label, her mother's name in the center. Below it in smaller letters, a Jalisco kitchen recipe, carried to Texas in 1971. Marisol stood still for a long moment. She said she never knew. Rosalind said she knew the recipe was worth keeping. She just didn't know how far it would go. A woman walked past them in the aisle and reached for the jar without looking at the label. She put it in her cart. She kept walking. Rosalind watched her go. Concepcion had crossed a border in 1971 with $40 and a recipe, and the understanding that if you could feed people, you had something. She had not known how many people. She had not specified. She had put the recipe into her daughter's hands the way you put something into the hands of a person you trust to carry it further than you can go. It was on this shelf now. It was in a cart moving toward the registers. It was going home with a stranger who did not know its name or its origin, or the woman who had built it from memory in a kitchen in Jalisco before Rosalind was born. It did not need to be known to do what it did. It only needed to be good enough that the person who opened it could not stop. Rosalind Vega had started with $37 in a checking account, 4 jars on a counter, and a recipe her mother never thought to write down until she did. She had not started with a dream. She had started with what she had, which turned out to be enough to start. I keep thinking about the mint plant. Rosalind watered it for a week after Arturo died, then stopped, then started again. The mint didn't know the difference. It grew anyway. That detail has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story, because I think it says something true about the way forward actually works. It doesn't require you to have it together. It only requires you to show up again. What Rosalind did was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean that word. She didn't have a breakthrough idea. She didn't find an investor, or win a contest, or get lucky in some clean, cinematic way. She opened a cabinet. She had peppers and garlic, and the memory of her mother's hands, and she made something with what was there. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. And yet that choice, made on a morning when she had $37 and an unopened letter from the bank, is what eventually put a jar with her mother's name on a shelf in 60 Target stores. I think about the sequence of it. How she didn't go from $37 to Target in one step. She went from $37 to a jar on a diner counter. Then, from a diner counter to a farmer's market table she shared with a woman who sold honey. Then from a shared table to a church kitchen. Then from a church kitchen to a commercial license. Then from a license to a co-packer in Seguin. Then from Seguin to a regional office in Austin. Each step was only visible from the step before it. She couldn't have planned the whole staircase from the bottom. She could only see the next one. That's what I want to sit with, because I think we get this wrong a lot. We wait to start until we can see the whole path. But the path doesn't work that way. It reveals itself in proportion to the movement you've already made. Rosalind couldn't see Target from Beaumont. She could see Phil Decker's diner counter from her kitchen, and that was enough. There's also something I want to say about the way she handled the hard parts, because there were hard parts, and she didn't get through them by being fearless. She got through them by being honest with herself and then doing the next thing anyway. When the commercial kitchen confused her, she wrote down what she learned. When the bad review came, she didn't collapse and she didn't ignore it. She went to the library and read for 2 hours and updated her labels and kept going. When she sat on the floor of the church kitchen after the Target call, she stayed there exactly as long as she needed to, and then she stood up and finished the batch. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The batch got finished. No matter what happened, the batch got finished. Not because she wasn't affected by things, because she had learned to let the feeling be what it was, and then return to the work. That discipline, the kind that doesn't come from not caring, but from caring too much to stop, is something you can't buy and can't be given. It has to be built in small increments over ordinary mornings when nobody is watching and the fluorescent lights are buzzing and the jars are still half full. Her mother crossed a border with $40 and a recipe, and the understanding that if you could feed people, you had something. Rosalind inherited that understanding and added to it, and someday Marisol will add to it too. That's how these things actually travel. Not through luck, through people who decided that what they were carrying was worth the effort of carrying it forward. If you had $37 and something your mother taught you, what would you do with it? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.